Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to Heythrop College for Refugee Stories Changing the Narrative. I'm Nick Austin, I'm a Jesuit priest and I've been teaching here ethics at Heythrop College since 2010. Our task today is really to reflect on the human realities of those who seek asylum in the UK. The human realities of refugees and asylum seekers. And we're looking at the possibility that their story can change the public narrative about refugees and those seeking asylum. The topic of refugees, of course, is extremely contemporary. Just in the last couple of days, we've heard about children being separated from their families in the States. We've heard about Italy refusing Aquarius to land on its own shores. And in this country, we've heard of the suicide of young men who've come here to seek asylum. Someone has just reminded me, of course, asylum is not a new topic. If we go back to the Hebrew scriptures, we find it an issue there. But I think that this is an urgent issue of our day, and it's only going to become more urgent in the light of increased migration and refugees in our global context. I want to begin by thanking the sponsors of this event, the Heythrop Institute for Religion and Society, which has helped to support this event. Also, the Jesuit Refugee Service in UK. And we've also been sponsored by the British province of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits in Britain. So thank you for your support, without which today would not be possible. We have a very exciting program. At 10 o'clock, Sarah Tether will be speaking, but before that, we're going to introduce the day. We're going to be quite careful about how we describe what we're attempting to do here, because this actually isn't the first moment in the process. We've had a process since January leading up to today. We want to explain how this project began and what's happened so far, so that we can all understand where we're coming from, as it were, today, which is really the culmination of the process. It's quite a remarkable process, I think, because it involves the collaboration of theologians and other academics, practitioners, those who accompany refugees, and also the voices of those who seek asylum themselves. And we're hoping that many of them will be our guests later in the day, probably from about the middle of the day onwards. We'll have many people who are seeking asylum here in the UK alongside us, and there'll be an opportunity to hear their voice during the whole process. Right now I'm going to hand over to Mike Cohen just for a brief word, because many of you will know Mike. He's been teaching at Heythrop for many years. He was head of Department of Theology here for many years, and he's currently the director of the Heythrop Institute for Religion and Society, whose annual conference this is. So Mike, over to you.
Nick, thank you very much. It's just a very brief word of welcome from me as the director of HERS, the Heythrop Institute for Religion and Society, which I have to say is one of the best jobs I've ever had, because it requires me to stand up and welcome people and look a little bit important, but in fact the work is being done by other people. The Heythrop Institute for Religion and Society is part of Heythrop College. Heythrop College is a college of theology and philosophy, very important theology and philosophy and the related disciplines. But if they don't connect with the real world, if they don't connect with society, then it's just a kind of head trip. And the Heythrop Institute for Religion and Society was started a number of years ago to ensure that we do plug into, we do connect with the real world and its concerns. The Institute started off life as the Heythrop Institute for Religion, Ethics and Public Life under James Henry. He was succeeded by Jim Sweeney, and I took over from Jim. I just want to mention that because this is the last Here's event. So I'm following on from a number of people who did wonderful work setting up basically a project that has a lot of different work streams. We look at religion and violence. We look at issues around theology and literature and spirituality. And we have the work that Gillian has been doing over a number of years now in health and human flourishing. And the suggestion that this project might be the last Here's event struck me as a very appropriate one because it's obviously, as Nick said, a very topical theme, very important theme. And I want to thank all of you for coming along today to explore that. But I will emphasize the work has not been done by me, it's been done by Nick, it's been done by Gillian, it's done by Sophie and the people at JRS, so well done to all of you. However, I will say that if you can stick it out for the full day, I hope you're able to stay for the reflection that we have in words and music later on. There's a drink reception afterwards, so there's an incentive to stick it out. But I've got very obsessed in the last couple of years by someone who really tried to change a narrative. His name is Friedrich Speer von Langenfeld, who's a German Jesuit of the 17th century. We're going to be listening to some of his music and some of his verse, but he's more important for our purposes today because he's one of the people who changed the narrative about witches and witchcraft and witch hunting in the early 17th century. A remarkable man, very little known, and our celebration scene will be around him as an example of someone who tries to change the story, change the narrative around the victims who need our help and our support.
So me and Sophie are just going to give you a little bit of the narrative about how this day came about. It began with Sarah Tether's question. Sarah basically, who's the director of the Jesuit Refugee Service in the UK, invited me to talk with her about what ethics can contribute to the public discussion about those seeking asylum in the UK, about refugees. Because if I'm representing you correctly, Sarah, she perceived a problem in our public narrative, in our public discourse. And we're all familiar with that, I think, the way the media portrays immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers, the way politicians talk about it, every politician trying to outdo the other in being hard and tough on immigration. And there's nothing there about the rights of refugees, about our responsibilities towards them. And is there anything that ethics can contribute towards changing that discourse, changing that narrative? Now, I was there with another social ethicist from the States, and I was talking with Gillian as well. And Gillian Patterson from Heythrop, she's a practical theologian who was excited about this topic as well, because we'd had this ethics conference last year in January on the future of theological ethics, but it was all very theoretical, and we wanted something that was much more grounded in practice. A comment she made, which I couldn't forget from that conference, was if it doesn't make a difference to practitioners on the ground, then why are we doing this? You know, why are we doing this theology? Why are we doing this ethics? So Gillian was excited about the idea of working with JRS, and we were trying to work out what can we contribute to the discussion. I made an initial proposal, being a sort of theoretical academic. I said, let's look at it through the lens of virtue. Let's think about the virtues of solidarity, of justice, of fairness, of compassion, of hospitality, of reconciliation. How do these relate to this issue of those seeking asylum? And we had it all planned out. We had people lined up to write on this. We recognized at this point the importance of narrative, so we were going to engage with literature and poetry and film. And we got a publisher, and everything was fine. Until me and Gillian went over to JRS in Wapping, and we had a conversation, and Sarah said, this isn't going to work. And we were a bit stumped. And Sarah said, it doesn't reflect our values at the Jesuit Refugee Service, because here we don't speak on behalf. of refugees. You know, we don't speak for them. We acknowledge them as persons in their right who are quite capable of speaking on their own behalf. And so if this doesn't involve the refugees as well as the practitioners and the academics, it can't work from our perspective. And so I remember that slightly awkward moment as we sat around the table, and I was thinking, you're right, of course you're right, but I don't know what to do next. Okay, so, so here was an academic theoretician having to think about, okay, let's not just be ivory tower and talk about this issue. This is really a question of people and their human realities, and we have to listen to them, we have to encounter them. It's not enough to do a sort of abstract study. And so we went away and back to the drawing board to think how to do this. I think the breakthrough came from Sophie. Sophie is the policy advisor at JRS. She's also got a doctorate in theology and is well versed with the needs of academics as well as practitioners. And she came up with this research methodology from the humanities and the social sciences called the co-production model. It's a horrible word, but the idea is very simple. It's just that in the research process, when you're working with a particular community or group, you acknowledge that that community, that those members are participants in the research process. They're participants in the research. We acknowledge that it's not just us who's understanding things, who's coming to new insights, who's doing the learning, but we're also acknowledging the insights and the contributions of those we're working with, those that we're listening to. The co-production model of research. So that was the breakthrough, I think. And so then we devised a process which involved, yes, academics and practitioners, but also those seeking asylum. That we would begin with an encounter, we would begin with listening to their voices, and we would include them at every stage, and that they would have a say in how the process went forward. So I think that's what makes this a somewhat unique project, Refugee Stories Changing the Narrative. This isn't just a group of academics coming up with the next bright idea. It's a collaborative project between those seeking asylum as well as academics and practitioners. Just to describe the co-production model, it's a little bit hit and miss. In the literature, I have this wonderful quotation that it's not about systematic hypotheses, it's not about structures of thought, it's not about orderly procedures, but potting shed, hit and miss, sorry I blew the roof off, but you know how it is, darling, craft work. So it's a bit unpredictable, and we found as we went along, we were adapting and changing and discerning as we went along as to what the next step was. We didn't take this conference out of the box. We know how to do an academic conference, invite the speakers, let's do it. Rather, we were discerning as we went along. The speakers we have invited this morning, David Hurd and Joshua Railton, were carefully chosen precisely because of their awareness of this value of the encounter of the stories of refugees. So although they've, as it were, come into this process at a later stage, they're people who are very much in tune with what we've been trying to do. And then in the afternoon, we will have two parallel sessions. One of the parallel sessions will have an interview with someone seeking asylum, and both sessions will have people presenting the results of their reflections after this encounter. I'm now going to hand over to Sophie, who's going to explain a bit about the conversations, therefore, that we've had in the build-up to this conference, which may help you to understand where we're coming from today.
As Nick has explained, we decided we wanted to co-produce research on the asylum system. Essentially, this was to tell stories about it that often remain untold. And this was to be largely ethical and theological research, but not entirely. So what we wanted was really a process in which refugees and academics did research together. And as Nick has pointed out, it really wasn't clear how that would work, what that was going to look like. We did have a couple of starting points that we wanted to hold on to. So first, quite obviously, we wanted to allow the voices of refugees to be heard and to ground our thinking, the whole project, in their expertise. And second, we wanted reflection on what was heard, both from the perspective of academic theology, ethics, we had an anthropologist as well, and from the perspective of refugee experience. So in this, we wanted to do more really than ensure sort of good raw data for academics to fashion into theology or ethics or whatever. So it was really important that we created space for equal interaction between theologians and refugees. So space and time for ideas to be shared, critiqued, and jointly developed. We realized that we needed a process that began by taking time to listen. And then, having listened, it would allow space for reflection. And then it would involve discussion around the fruits of that reflection. It also had to make use of and give room to the distinctive gifts that everyone involved was bringing to the table. And as we thought a bit more about these gifts, we realized that practitioners working with refugees had something distinctive and valuable to bring, particularly continuing the ethical theme, thinking about the ethics of praxis here. So ultimately, we decided on 2 sets of structured conversations in small groups between refugees, academics, and practitioners. The first conversations would focus on listening to refugees and practitioners. And then the second would offer an opportunity for refugees and practitioners to listen to academics reflect on what they'd heard from the perspective of their disciplines. And then they'd get a chance to correct anything that they maybe felt had been misheard, to affirm anything they thought was really good, and generally to comment, to critique and to move the conversation forward. So we were really seeking a space where ideas could be honed, they could be challenged and developed together. Now, on the theme of sort of blowing the roof off, this hasn't been a completely smooth process. It hasn't been, and it continues not to be. A couple of examples. We wondered, do we actually need 3 conversations? One that's just devoted to making sure that what was said is what was heard, and then a third for the reflection. Also, a question about how much we mixed the groups up, whether we wanted continuity, complete continuity of the small groups across the different conversations, or to bring different people into conversation with each other at different points. So there's a couple of questions. In any case, we really hope that this is still an early stage in a wider collaboration between the Jesuit Refugee Service and the academics and other people that we work with. So, as Nick mentioned, research-wise, you will hear some early fruits of the collaboration this afternoon. There will be talks that are grounded in the conversations that took place, and a refugee participant will also be speaking about her experience of the asylum system via an interview, and she'll be exploring themes that arose in the conversations there. So, thinking about going forward, I would like to highlight 2 related aspects of the process that we think are really good, or I think are really good, and hope that we hold on to. The first is mutual openness, and the second is encounter between different spheres. Okay, so mutual openness. Being conversations, these had to be a two-way street. Everyone involved shared something. Not only is everyone bringing something distinctive to the table, but we opened the conversations with everyone, every person involved, just sharing something about themselves with the group. I think I talked about my niece. It's not necessarily a big thing, but it meant that we all began by engaging on a human level. And related to this, although the conversations were focused on refugee experience, it wasn't only the refugees who had something personally at stake in them. I think it would be unfair to deny that they probably had more at stake. But I felt, and I noticed, that by the second conversation, the process of reflecting had brought us academics to see ourselves and our society in a new light. So, I think this was, in a sense, a dialogical form of accompaniment. Now, okay, what's that? It's really core. Accompaniment is really core to JRS's mission, core to our values. To accompany is to be with and to support, but not in a completely asymmetrical, one-sided way. It's in being with and accompanying refugees, we seek to acknowledge our mutual vulnerability, our mutual brokenness, and also to recognize that we learn a lot from refugees, as certainly I did in this process, normally much more than they do from us, in fact. So, okay, this learning, I think this brings us to the second point. Encounter between different spheres. A big part of the purpose was, of course, to bring academic theology into direct contact with refugee experience, and allow it, frankly, to be challenged by that experience. But there was also a strong sense that academia, that ethics and theology had something really useful to bring, and could really help to reflect fruitfully on these experiences. So, importantly, the different spheres involved were not discrete, not completely separate. Some of the practitioners involved were also refugees. Some of the academics were also practitioners. So this was a messy and multi-layered encounter happening within and seeking to grapple with a messy and multi-layered world, really. And we hope that this dynamic will continue into the symposium today. We've made a deliberate choice, as Nick said, to have some speakers who were not involved in the conversations. This is really because these conversations, they're happening in a wider context. We want to bring them into dialogue with that context. And related to this, we wanted to include in both sections of the conference academics such as Joshua Ralston and Sarah Silvestri, whose own ongoing work on refugees and migration already includes close collaboration with the communities they write about. Similarly, David Hurd, who's one of our speakers for this morning, will be speaking from his experience with Refugee Tales, which is focused on telling the stories of people's experience of immigration detention from their own perspective, i.e. of giving people subjected to immigration detention a voice. So in this way, we hope to frame our conversations with related projects and approaches, both academic and other, and this will hopefully add another layer to the reflection as we go forward to the reflection and encounter. So essentially, today is another step in this exciting and somewhat experimental project. We thank you for joining us in it, and we hope very much that you enjoy it. Okay.
Before we get too carried away talking about the history and everything that it is important as well that today is a very interesting conversation, and just looking at the faces of all of you, the participants in this room, we hope that you will feel that you have a contribution to this process as well. Some of you work with accompany refugees in various organizations. Others of you are students or academics. Others of you are just interested in this issue as a concerned citizen. And so we hope that your voices will be very, very much valued in this process as well. Okay, so let's begin with our first keynote speaker, Sarah Tether. Sarah, as many of you know, is the director of GRS UK since January 2016. She was also an MP and a government minister, and has a long history in concern about the issues of immigration and asylum, arguing for a more compassionate politics. So Sarah, we're delighted to have you to speak to us today. Thank you.